back to Strange Epochs. I'm Sean Spainhour, and this is the show where we take one strange, true, documented moment from somewhere in the long and bewildering span of human history, and we sit with it. New episodes every Tuesday. Sources are always in the episode description. This week we are going to southern China. The year is 1836. A 22-year-old man named Hong Xiuquan is walking home from the provincial capital of Guangzhou, having just failed the imperial civil service examination for the second time. He is exhausted, humiliated, and carrying a small packet of Christian pamphlets that a missionary handed him on the street, pamphlets he will not fully read for another 6 years. Within 2 years, he will suffer a complete mental breakdown. He will spend 40 days in a delirious state, during which he will have visions of a golden-bearded old man and a middle-aged man who he will later identify as God the Father and Jesus Christ. God the Father will give him a sword and command him to exterminate demons. The middle-aged man will call him brother. When Hong finally reads the missionary pamphlets 6 years after receiving them, he will recognize the description of Jesus Christ and understand, with complete and terrible clarity, what his visions meant. He is the younger brother of Jesus Christ, the second son of God, sent to China to destroy demons, overthrow the Qing dynasty, and establish the Taiping Rebellion, the heavenly kingdom of great peace on earth. What follows is the bloodiest civil war in human history. The Taiping Rebellion lasted 14 years, from 1850 to 1864. Estimates of the death toll range from 20 million to 30 million people. Some scholars have suggested numbers as high as 50 million. To put that in context, more people may have died in the Taiping Rebellion than in the First World War, a conflict that killed as many people as a world war, led by a man who believed he was the brother of Jesus Christ and that most people in the Western world have never heard of. This is that story. Let's begin. Guangdong Province, China, 1837. Hong Xiuquan has been in bed for 40 days. His family is frightened. He came home from Guangzhou pale and barely speaking, and then he collapsed. He has been feverish, delirious, alternately violent, and completely still. He has shouted at things his family cannot see. He has wept. He has spoken in fragments about a golden-bearded old man and commands he has been given and demons that must be destroyed. His family does not know what is happening to him. They know only that the young man who left the village to take the imperial examination, the brilliant young man who had ranked first in his district's preliminary tests, the young man whose success was going to lift the family into a better life, has come home broken. What Hong is experiencing, in the language of the culture he grew up in, would be understood as a serious spiritual crisis, possibly a possession, possibly a visit from the divine. In the language of a modern medical evaluation, the symptoms suggest an acute psychotic episode, possibly triggered by the sustained stress and public humiliation of examination failure in a society where examination success was the primary route to status and advancement. Both of these framings contain something true. Neither one fully explains what will happen next. After 40 days, he recovers. He is quieter than before, changed. He speaks less about the visions as the months pass, and his family, relieved that he is functional again, does not press him about them. He returns to teaching at a local school. He takes the examination a third time in 1840 and fails again. He takes it a fourth time in 1843 and fails again. After the fourth failure, he goes home and picks up the packet of Christian pamphlets that have been sitting, mostly unread, since the missionary handed them to him on the street in 1836. He reads them carefully this time. The pamphlets Hong read were a translation of Christian scripture and teaching, produced by a Chinese convert and missionary named Liang Afa. Liang's work, Quanxi Liangyan, Good Words to Admonish the Age, was a distillation of Christian teaching designed for a Chinese audience that had no prior familiarity with the biblical tradition. It emphasized the Old Testament God of power and commandment, the coming of Jesus Christ as the Son of God, the nature of salvation, and the moral demands of Christian life. It was not a sophisticated theological document. It was a missionary pamphlet designed to convey the essential elements of Christianity simply and accessibly. For Hong, reading it in 1843 with the memory of his vision 6 years earlier, it was a revelation in the most literal sense. Everything that had happened to him during those 40 days suddenly made sense. He reads about God the Father. He reads about Jesus Christ, the Son of God. He reads about the mission of salvation and the coming of the kingdom of heaven. And the pieces come together. The golden-bearded old man in his vision was God the Father. The middle-aged man who called him brother was Jesus Christ. He is not a failed examination candidate from a village in Guangdong. He is the second Son of God, the younger brother of Jesus Christ, sent to China with a divine mission that the examination system, the corrupt, demon-infested examination system of the Qing dynasty, has been trying to prevent him from fulfilling. The mission is clear. The demons must be destroyed. Act 1. The Man and His World. To understand Hong Xiuquan, you have to understand the specific world that produced him, because his story is not simply the story of a man who had a vision and chose to believe it. It is the story of that vision meeting a society that was in serious trouble, a dynasty that was losing its legitimacy, and a population that was desperate enough to follow someone who offered a total alternative to the world as it existed. The Qing dynasty, which had ruled China since 1644, was by the 1830s in a state of accelerating decline. The problems were structural and had been building for decades. China's population had roughly tripled since the beginning of the Qing period, from perhaps 150 million to over 400 million people, without a corresponding expansion of arable land or economic opportunity. The land was crowded. Competition for resources was intense. The traditional routes to advancement, the imperial examination system, which theoretically allowed men of talent from any background to enter the bureaucracy, were increasingly clogged. More men competed for fewer positions. Failure was becoming the norm rather than the exception. The imperial examination system deserves a moment of attention because it is central to understanding Hong's specific anguish. The Keiju, the Chinese civil service examination system, was, in theory, one of the most meritocratic institutions in the pre-modern world. It was open to virtually all men, regardless of social background. It tested knowledge of classical texts, literary skill, and the ability to compose formal essays on prescribed topics. Men who passed its highest levels entered the imperial bureaucracy and could rise to positions of enormous power and prestige. Men who failed spent their lives outside the system that ran China, dependent on other means of livelihood, unable to access the political power that examination success conferred. The system had been in place in various forms for over 1,000 years. It was not simply a route to employment. It was the primary path to social legitimacy in a society that valued learning above almost everything else. Failing it, repeatedly, was not a private disappointment. It was a public verdict on your worth. Hong was Hakka, an ethnic subgroup within the Han Chinese population that had its own distinct dialect, customs, and social position. The Hakka were relative newcomers to many of the areas where they lived, having migrated from the north over centuries, and they occupied a lower social position than the established local populations in many parts of southern China. They faced discrimination. They had fewer access to the best agricultural land. They competed, sometimes violently, with the established Cantonese-speaking population for resources and position. Hong's failure at the examinations was not simply a personal defeat. It was consistent with the structural disadvantage that the Hakka community faced in a system that favored established elite families. The Opium Wars added another layer of crisis. Britain's wars with China in 1840 to 1842 and 1856 to 1860 had humiliated the Qing dynasty in ways that were visible and undeniable. The treaties that followed, which opened Chinese ports to foreign trade, granted extraterritorial rights to Western nationals, and forced China to legalize the opium trade, signaled to the Chinese population that their rulers could not protect them from foreign power. The Qing dynasty, already facing internal stress, was now visibly failing to defend China's sovereignty against external pressure. The legitimacy that came from the mandate of heaven, the ancient Chinese doctrine that heaven conferred the right to rule on those who governed justly and withdrew it from those who failed, was clearly eroding. Into this landscape of crowded land, failed examinations, humiliation by foreign powers, and a dynasty losing its mandate, Hong Xiuquan arrived with a message. The opium crisis deserves specific mention because it is the dimension of the background that most directly shaped the human landscape Hong was recruiting from. Opium had been introduced to China by Western traders, and by the 1830s, it had created a significant addiction epidemic in southern China. Men who had been productive farmers or craftsmen had been reduced to dependency. Families had been impoverished. The Qing dynasty's attempt to suppress the trade had resulted in the Opium Wars and the humiliating treaties that followed, including the legalization of the very drug the dynasty had been trying to ban. The people who joined the God Worshippers Society were not simply the economically poor. Many of them were the specifically, recently, traumatically poor people whose lives had been damaged by forces they could see and resent, but could not individually resist. The promise of a heavenly kingdom where opium was forbidden, where property was shared, where the Manchu usurpers had been driven out and God's justice had been established. This was not an abstract theological proposition. It was a specific promise about a specific problem. He began preaching in 1843, shortly after his fourth examination failure and his reading of the missionary pamphlets. His theology was a remarkable improvisation. He took the Christian framework, God the Father, Jesus Christ the Son, heaven and earth, demons, and salvation, and mapped it onto Chinese religious categories and his own visions in ways that produced something genuinely new. He was not a conventional Christian, and Western missionaries who encountered his movement were deeply uncomfortable with it. He rejected the Trinity as he understood it. He saw himself as a separate son of God, co-equal in divine status with Jesus Christ, but distinct from him. He interpreted the first commandment, "Thou shalt have no other gods before me," as a command to destroy the idols, the Confucian tablets, the Buddhist and Taoist religious objects that filled Chinese temples and households. He interpreted it as a command to overthrow the Manchu Qing rulers, whom he characterized as demonic usurpers of a Chinese throne. The specific content of Hong's theology is worth examining because it reveals both his genuine engagement with the Christian materials he had read and the extraordinary creative freedom with which he reworked them. He accepted the Old Testament God of power and commandment with enthusiasm. He was less interested in the New Testament God of mercy and forgiveness. He understood his mission in primarily destructive terms: to eliminate demons, to overthrow the demonic order, to clear the ground for the heavenly kingdom. The demons in his theology were not abstract spiritual forces. They were concrete. The Qing dynasty's Manchu rulers, the Buddhist and Taoist priesthoods, the Confucian scholarly establishment, the opium traders, anyone who represented the existing order that God had sent him to destroy. This gave his movement a specific quality of total war against existing society that went beyond ordinary political rebellion and tapped into something more elemental in the communities he was recruiting from. His followers gathered around a movement he called the Bai Shangdi Hui, the God Worshippers Society. They came from the margins, poor Hakka farmers, miners, displaced workers, people who had failed the examinations, people who had lost land, people who had been made desperate by opium addiction or by the violence of the ongoing conflicts between Hakka and Cantonese communities in the region. They were people who had nothing to lose from a total transformation of the existing order and everything to gain from the heavenly kingdom that Hong promised. By 1850, the God worshippers had several thousand followers and had begun attracting the attention of Qing authorities. In January of 1851, when the Qing sent forces to crush the movement, Hong did not disperse. He declared the establishment of the Taiping Tianguo, the heavenly kingdom of great peace, and assumed the title of Tianwang, the heavenly king. The rebellion had begun. Act 2. The Kingdom and the War. The early years of the Taiping Rebellion had a momentum that seemed almost miraculous to those who witnessed it. An army of peasant believers, armed with captured weapons and powered by an absolute conviction that God was on their side and demons on the other, moved through southern China with a speed and a violence that the Qing forces could not contain. They captured cities. They incorporated defeated soldiers into their ranks, swelling their numbers with each victory. By 1853, less than 2 years after the declaration of the Heavenly Kingdom, the Taiping armies had swept through Hunan and Hubei and captured Nanjing, the former imperial capital, which they renamed Tianjin, the Heavenly Capital, and made the center of their new state. Part of the Taiping army's early effectiveness came from its specific social composition and military organization. The God Worshippers Society had, before the rebellion formally began, already functioned as a community of mutual protection and support among Hakka families who were engaged in ongoing violent conflicts with Cantonese-speaking neighbors. They were accustomed to organizing collectively for defense and offense. Many of the men who formed the core of the Taiping forces had experience with the kind of irregular, decentralized fighting that the initial stages of the rebellion required. They were motivated in a way that the Qing's professional army, fighting for pay and facing an enemy that seemed to have divine sanction, often was not. Qing soldiers surrendered or defected in significant numbers, and the Taiping practice of incorporating surrendered soldiers into their own forces meant that victories multiplied their strength rather than merely reducing the enemies. Nanjing was then one of the largest cities in the world. Its capture was not a guerrilla raid or a skirmish. It was the conquest of a major metropolitan center by a rebel army that had covered hundreds of miles in months and had demonstrated repeatedly a military capability that shocked the dynasty they were fighting. The Taiping forces were not merely a religious cult. They were an army, disciplined in their own specific way, organized around the conviction that they were doing God's work and that God's work required the total transformation of every institution and custom of Chinese society. The social program of the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom was radical in ways that are worth understanding because it explains both the movement's enormous popular appeal and the ferocity of the opposition it eventually generated. Hong and his followers proposed the abolition of private property and the communal ownership of land. They proposed the equal distribution of land to both men and women, a revolutionary departure from Chinese tradition. They proposed the prohibition of opium, tobacco, and alcohol. They proposed the abolition of slavery and the sale of women. They proposed the equality of men and women before God, including the right of women to take the examinations, an institution Hong had otherwise abolished as corrupt and demonic. And they proposed the destruction of all forms of traditional Chinese religion, Buddhist and Taoist temples, Confucian shrines and texts, the ancestral tablets that stood at the center of Chinese family life. All of it was demonic. All of it had to go. This last element, the assault on Confucianism and traditional religion, proved to be one of the rebellion's most significant strategic errors. Confucianism was not merely a philosophical system for the Chinese scholarly elite. It was the organizing principle of Chinese social life, the system that defined the relationships between ruler and subject, father and son, husband and wife, elder and younger, and that gave those relationships their moral weight and their social legitimacy. The Taiping attack on Confucianism horrified the educated gentry class, which might otherwise have been sympathetic to a rebellion against the Qing dynasty. The gentry organized. They financed and led local armies, the most important of which was led by a scholar general named Zheng Gufan, that would eventually prove more effective against the Taiping than the Qing regular army had been. The contradictions within the Heavenly Kingdom were visible from its early years. Hong preached strict sexual morality while maintaining a large court of wives and concubines. He preached communal property while living in extraordinary luxury. He preached a direct relationship between individuals and God while ruthlessly suppressing any claim to divine communication that threatened his own authority. The gap between the kingdom's ideals and its governance grew wider as the movement succeeded and its leadership became a court rather than a community. The early converts who had joined, drawn by promises of equality, found themselves subjects of a divine king whose earthly arrangements replicated many features of the world they had been promised would be destroyed. Inside the heavenly kingdom, the reality of governance proved considerably less heavenly than the vision. Hong retreated increasingly into the heavenly capital. Surrounded by his court and his consorts, he accumulated a large number of wives and concubines, a departure from the strict sexual morality he preached for everyone else. He became suspicious, autocratic, and prone to violent purges of his own leadership. The most dramatic of these was the Tianjin incident of 1856, in which Hong ordered the massacre of one of his most important military commanders, Hong Xiuquan, along with Yang's entire faction. Yang had been claiming to speak directly as the voice of God, a claim that Hong had initially accepted, but that had grown into a political and theological rivalry that Hong resolved through wholesale slaughter. Thousands died in the purge. The military capacity of the heavenly kingdom was severely damaged at a moment when it needed all the strength it had. The Western powers, initially uncertain about which side to support, eventually threw their weight behind the Qing. The ever-victorious army, a force of Chinese soldiers commanded by Western officers, most famously the British officer Frederick Townsend Ward, and later the equally British Charles Gordon, who would later die at Khartoum, worked alongside the Qing forces and the gentry armies to push the Taiping back. By 1862 and 63, the military tide had clearly turned. The Taiping forces were being driven back toward Nanjing. City after city was retaken. The territory of the Heavenly Kingdom contracted. The Western relationship with the Taiping Rebellion is one of its most interesting dimensions. Western missionaries and diplomats who initially encountered the Taiping were uncertain whether to be hopeful or alarmed. On one hand, here was a massive popular movement in China that claimed to be Christian, that worshipped the Christian God, that had banned opium and prostitution, that was fighting the Qing dynasty, that had humiliated Western traders in the Opium Wars. On the other hand, Hong's theology was deeply unorthodox. His claim to be the brother of Jesus Christ was theologically impossible from any mainstream Christian perspective, and his relationship to Western foreigners, once his kingdom was established, was hostile rather than welcoming. He sent Western visitors away with contempt. He demanded that they submit to his authority as the Son of God. He was not interested in the kind of missionary Christianity that the pamphlets had introduced him to. He had taken what he needed from it and built something of his own. Hong Xiuquan, in the final months of his kingdom, became increasingly erratic. When food supplies in Nanjing ran low, he declared that the city would eat manna from heaven and demonstrated his point by publicly picking weeds from the ground and eating them to show that divine nourishment was available to the faithful. Unfortunately, some of the weeds he chose were poisonous. He died in June of 1864. The official cause listed as illness, though the poisoning has been proposed as a possible contributing factor. He was 50 years old. The final siege of Nanjing lasted from May to July of 1864. The city was surrounded. Supplies were exhausted. Hong's declarations of divine provision grew more frantic as the reality of starvation became undeniable. The defenders knew there would be no mercy if the city fell. They had seen what happened to Taiping-held cities that the Qing retook. The slaughter was systematic. There were no political prisoners taken. There was no negotiation. The Qing forces and the gentry armies they supported intended to exterminate the movement entirely, to leave no remnant that could reconstitute itself, to finish what 14 years of war had started. His teenage son briefly succeeded him. Nanjing fell to the Qing forces the following month, in July of 1864. The Qing showed no mercy. The defenders of the city were slaughtered. Hong's body was exhumed, cremated, and his ashes fired from a cannon, so that he would have no resting place, no grave that could become a shrine, no physical remnant around which the survivors of his movement could organize. The destruction of his body was the dynasty's final attempt to destroy the idea he had become. It did not entirely work. Act 3. What the Taiping Rebellion left behind. The death toll of the Taiping Rebellion is one of the most contested and sobering numbers in the history of human conflict. Reliable estimates range from 20 million to 30 million deaths. Some scholars, accounting for the indirect casualties of famine and disease that followed the destruction of the agricultural infrastructure of southern China, have proposed numbers as high as 50 million. The range of uncertainty is itself staggering. The difference between the low and high estimates is larger than the total death toll of the First World War. What we know with certainty is that the Taiping Rebellion was devastating at a scale that is difficult to comprehend. The major cities of southern China were not merely captured and recaptured. They were repeatedly fought over, their populations slaughtered or displaced, their buildings burned, their agricultural hinterlands stripped bare by armies that lived off the land they moved through. Regions that had been among the most productive and prosperous in China were depopulated to a degree that took generations to recover from. The province of Anhui lost an estimated 2/3 of its population. The province of Jiangsu lost comparable proportions. Towns that had been flourishing commercial centers were empty ruins. The human beings behind these numbers are almost entirely invisible in the historical record, which tends to focus on the military and political dimensions of the conflict. The vast majority of the dead were civilians, farmers who starved when their crops were destroyed, families who died of disease in the aftermath of sieges, people who were killed by both sides as suspected sympathizers with the other, children who did not survive the famines that followed the destruction of the normal economic and agricultural order. Their names are not recorded. Their stories are not told. The Taiping Rebellion is, among other things, a reminder of how completely large numbers can obscure the individual human reality behind them. 20 million is a number. 20 million is also 20 million specific people, each of whom had a name and a family and a life that was ended or damaged by what happened in southern China between 1850 and 1864. There is a specific problem with trying to communicate the Taiping Rebellion to a Western audience that is worth naming directly. The event is virtually unknown in the West. This is not because it was minor, it was, by any measure, one of the most significant events of the 19th century. It is because the Western historical tradition has tended to treat the 19th century as primarily the story of European industrialization, imperialism, and political development, with the rest of the world appearing mainly as the object of European action rather than as the site of its own enormous histories. The Taiping Rebellion happened in the middle of the American Civil War, which killed approximately 650,000 people. The American Civil War has been the subject of more books than any other event in American history. The Taiping Rebellion, which killed between 30 and 80 times as many people, is barely mentioned in most Western history curricula. This is a significant distortion of what the 19th century actually was. The Qing dynasty survived the rebellion but never recovered from it. The effort required to put down the Taiping had accelerated the very processes of decentralization that would eventually destroy the dynasty. The gentry armies that had been most effective against the Taiping Zhang Guofan's Xiang army and Li Hongzhang's Huai army had been financed by provincial resources and commanded by provincial leaders, not by the central government. The power that had flowed to the provinces to fight the Taiping did not fully return to the center when the fighting ended. The dynasty that emerged from the rebellion was weaker, more dependent on regional power structures, less able to project central authority than it had been before. The slow collapse of Qing power that would culminate in the Revolution of 1911 was significantly accelerated by the Taiping Rebellion. The rebellion's legacy in Chinese political culture is complicated and has shifted over time. The Qing dynasty and the traditional Chinese scholarly elite remembered it as a catastrophic assault on civilization, on Confucian order, on the social fabric, on everything that had made China, China. The Taiping's destruction of temples, their rejection of Confucianism, their social radicalism was experienced by the educated class, not as liberation, but as barbarism. Later Chinese revolutionaries, including Sun Yat-sen and Mao Zedong, claimed the Taiping as predecessors, as early examples of the revolutionary tradition that would eventually transform China. Sun Yat-sen, who was himself from Guangdong and from a Hakka community, explicitly identified with the Taiping. Mao saw in the Taiping a proto-communist movement, an early attempt to build a society of common property and equality that had been suppressed by class enemies before its time. This appropriation of the Taiping legacy by later Chinese political movements is itself a strange epoch, a movement that was, at its core, a millenarian Christian sect claiming divine sanction for a violent transformation of Chinese society, remembered as a forerunner of secular revolutionary nationalism and Marxist communism. The Qing dynasty's final decades were shaped decisively by what the Taiping Rebellion had cost and changed. The self-strengthening movement that emerged in the rebellion's aftermath, the effort by reformers like Li Hongzhang and Zheng Guofan to modernize the Chinese military and economy along Western lines in order to prevent future catastrophes, was a direct response to what the Taiping had exposed about the dynasty's vulnerability. The reforms were partial, too slow, and ultimately insufficient. The Qing dynasty collapsed in 1911. The revolution that replaced it, led by Sun Yat-sen, who grew up listening to stories about Hong Xiuquan from old men who had lived through the rebellion, explicitly invoked the Taiping as predecessors. The line from the shoemaker's son who failed his examinations to the republic that replaced the dynasty runs through 20 million deaths and 60 years of compounding crisis. And then there is Hong Xiuquan himself, whose story resists easy categorization in ways that have made him a perennial subject of fascination and controversy. He was a man who failed 4 times at an examination that defined the possibilities of his life, who experienced a breakdown that rearranged his understanding of himself and his place in the world, who found in a packet of Christian pamphlets a framework that made sense of everything that had happened to him, and who then proceeded to build, on the foundation of that framework, one of the most powerful and destructive religious and political movements in the history of the 19th century. Was he sincere? Almost certainly. The evidence suggests that Hong genuinely believed he was the son of God. He never abandoned the claim, even when it would have been politically advantageous to moderate it. He built an entire world around it, shaped his governance by it, made decisions, some of them catastrophically wrong, on the basis of it. He died inside the kingdom he had built, eating weeds he believed to be manna, in a city that was about to fall. If he doubted, the record does not show it. Was he mad? This is a more complicated question than it first appears. The vision he experienced during his breakdown was, by any clinical assessment, a psychotic episode, but the interpretive framework he built around that vision, the theology, the social program, the military strategy, was the work of a functioning intelligence that shaped world events for 14 years and killed tens of millions of people. The line between madness and vision, between delusion and charisma, between the individual breakdown and the social movement that it produces, is not a line that history has drawn cleanly in this case or in many others. History has produced a long line of figures who combine genuine visionary experience with the capacity for organized violence on an enormous scale. Hong belongs to that list. His movement transformed Chinese history, weakened one of the world's great dynasties, and killed more people than most of the wars that the Western world considers definitive. It was also built on a foundation of sincere religious conviction that began with a pamphlet handed to a young man on a Guangzhou street, and a 40-day breakdown in a village in Guangdong that his family did not know how to interpret. Between that pamphlet and the cannon that fired his ashes into the July sky of 1864, the distance is incomprehensible. The human mind does not readily scale from a missionary tract to 20 million dead, but the path between them ran through a real place, in a real time, through the specific circumstances of 19th century southern China, and through one specific human mind that was brilliantly capable of certain things and catastrophically wrong about others. What is clear is that Hong Xiuquan was the product of a specific conjunction of circumstances. A brilliant man from a disadvantaged community in a society whose meritocratic ideals were failing its most talented people, who experienced a genuine breakdown at a moment of personal crisis and organized his recovery around a theology that gave his suffering cosmic significance in a country where 20 million people were desperate enough for a total transformation of the world that they were willing to die for his version of heaven. The question of what Hong actually experienced is one that historians and psychologists have been discussing since the 1970s, when serious academic attention to the rebellion began producing more than politically motivated hagiography or denunciation. The 40-day breakdown of 1837 is, by any clinical description, consistent with an acute psychotic episode. The visions were detailed, elaborate, and involved the kinds of command hallucinations, voices directing the sufferer to act, that are characteristic of certain psychotic disorders. The subsequent behavior, the grandiosity, the special mission, the sense of divine election, the absolute certainty of divine authority, is consistent with a manic or psychotic personality structure, though retrospective diagnosis across a century and a half of cultural distance is deeply uncertain. But the clinical framework is also insufficient on its own, because it does not explain the extraordinary effectiveness that Hong demonstrated in the early years of the movement, building a religious organization from scratch, articulating a theology, attracting followers, organizing a military force, capturing major cities. These are not the achievements of someone whose cognitive function has been simply destroyed. Hong was doing something genuine and something creative. He was building out of the materials of his experience, his reading, and the social conditions of his time, something that met a need that no existing institution was meeting. That the thing he built was also catastrophically destructive is true. That the person who built it was operating under genuine delusions is almost certainly true. Both things coexist. They often do. The ashes that were fired from a cannon in July of 1864 have long since dispersed. There is no grave for the heavenly king. There is no resting place for the second son of God. There is only the memory of what he started, and the 20 million people who died in it, and the question that any honest engagement with this story eventually produces: what exactly is the difference between a prophet and a madman, and who gets to decide? That's what Strange Epochs is. Stories that have no clean endings. Moments that history recorded, but never quite explained. Events that undeniably happened, and yet still, somehow, feel impossible. The Taiping Rebellion ended in 1864. China did not fully recover for generations. The dynasty that survived the rebellion was a weakened, structurally compromised version of the institution that had begun it, and it had 47 years left before it fell in the Revolution of 1911. Sun Yat-sen, the founding father of the Chinese Republic, was born in 1866, 2 years after the rebellion ended, in Guangdong province, the same province where Hong Xiuquan had been born 52 years before him. He grew up hearing about the heavenly king from men who had lived through the rebellion. He described Hong Xiuquan as China's first revolutionary, a man who had tried to build something new before the conditions for success existed. The connection between a failed examination candidate's vision in 1837 and the fall of the last Chinese dynasty in 1911 is not a straight line, but it is a real one. Everything you heard in this episode is real. Every name, every date, every detail drawn from documented historical sources. All of the sources for this episode are listed in the episode description below. I encourage you to look them up. If you enjoyed this episode, please follow Strange Epochs wherever you listen. New episodes drop every Tuesday. And if you want to help the show grow, leaving a review goes a long way. It really does. I'll see you next week. I'm Sean Spainhour. This is Strange Epochs.